Hello, welcome back to another chess video here. So let's start by finding our game here within the 1510 rapid time control on our account here. So let's see who will be playing. Alright, so it looks like we're playing against about 1800 rated opponent here, and we're playing with the black pieces. So we have queen pawn, to which we respond knight f6. That's my, this is my opening preparation versus the queen pawn, and we're going for the King's Indian setup here. So knight f6 followed by g6, and then fianchettoing the bishop. And we have the standard responses from our opponent. So d6, yeah, knight f3, knight c3 here is pretty standard. And then e3 here is a little bit interesting. An early e3, I would say, rather than e4 is a typical move we have in the King's Indian. And to this, I think we can just continue our plan. We can castle here first. And then we can look to play e5 here, probably. Does e5 work in this position? Let's takes. I'm not sure if e5 works quite already, but we'll see. But probably the normal way to develop for white from this point would be maybe bishop to e2 and then castle. Bishop g4 is also an idea here, depending on where this bishop goes to. But let's see how our opponent responds here. Yeah, normally the pawn is not on e3. And it's a little bit bad because this bishop back here, we can notice, is kind of trapped in for the time being. I mean, maybe he wants to fianchetto it to make this work. But I'm not sure that this is really a standard developing line for the King's against the King's Indian defense here. So we'll see how our opponent continues. I've seen this kind of system where the bishop is placed here, kind of like a London system, maybe, but never e3 before we've developed this bishop here is a little bit interesting. So we'll see. It's an interesting way to play the opening here. So our opponent taking their time here. So yeah, bishop e2 is probably standard here. Now we can contemplate, should calculate probably, does e5 work in this position? Well, e5 I calculate takes, rook takes, knight takes. And I don't know if there's any tactics to win back that knight at the end of the line, because normally you sacrifice the knight in order to take the pawn on e4, right? The pawn that's usually on e4 in the King's Indian, but now we're not actually sacking it. We're just revealing an attack, and after takes, we're actually not regaining back that pawn since that pawn is on e3. So the move e3 kind of makes it, I guess, harder for us in a sense to push e5. And I think that means we have to, in a way, either prepare e5 for one more move, or go with another idea such as c5 is definitely a way. Certainly the Benoni style way to play the King's Indian, which is an alternate way. Or we can go for something like knight bd7, which is also a very common knight placement in the King's Indian here. So let me think about it. I think probably c5. And after d5, e6 here is the way I would play this, especially considering this bishop is not here, pinning our knight. Rook e1 doesn't really do that much because the queen... Rook e1 doesn't really do anything to set up e5, because after rook e8, let's say castles here, let me just draw it. Rook e8, castles, here, not knight takes. Queen takes, and then the rook has to come to d8 anyway to recapture, then the knight recaptures. So what we can do is we can play knight c6. We can play bishop g4. Knight c6 is probably bad since our pawn isn't on e5, but let's play c5, I think, is my preferred way to play this. When we can't go with the e5 pawn break, you can always go with the alternate pawn break c5. Okay, so now I think definitely we can take here. But maybe we don't want to take. Let's see. Because that will just allow his piece to become more active. Well, we'll see. I think taking here is fine, probably, because our pawn structure is now very solid. He maintains a space advantage here, but we can play something like d5 to try to nullify the center space advantage. And I think something like c4 is making serious concessions, such as the weak pawn here on e4 that we will relentlessly target with our pieces here. If he is to not cooperate and, let's say, try to push c4, we're going to do everything in our power in order to pressure this weak pawn here and open up the diagonal. So now we can play something like knight here. Definitely. Our bishop also has a very open route. We could even play like an interesting idea is bishop to e6 in order to pressure this pawn. In order to also not run into like g4 here if we place it on f5. Let's probably play knight c6 first. Develop our knights first is usually how the principles go, right? And then maybe consider playing bishop to e6 here. And we add pressure here as well. So rook e8 is a little bit slow. Do we have something like this? No, he just takes. But bishop e6 now, if he plays something like b3 to guard it, now I think we have this. Well, we might have this right away, because let's say he takes, we take this knight, recapture here. Yeah. Knight here, takes, kicks the knight, right? So that's the idea, is that we're winning this pawn. But knight here, takes, could be a problem. So maybe we have to set it up with something like bishop here. Let's set it up with this. All right, now we can play. I think knight takes is definitely the superior option here out of the three pieces we can recapture with, since it opens up this bishop. And now we pressure this piece even more here, this pawn. And now we notice that we have an isolated queen's pawn here. And so we can begin targeting, we can use this as a long-term weakness here. We can keep in mind that this d4 pawn here is a long-term weakness in the white position, and we can look to target it with our pieces here. All right, so I don't think we want to exchange here and allow him to rectify his pawn structure immediately. But we could play something like queen here. In order to add additional attackers and also discourage this bishop from being developed. Although it could be developed here, we could then take it with a knight. Is there alternate ways to play this? Let's see. We could also just simply like stack our rooks here. Bishop here can take. So it does discourage this bishop from being developed. Bishop here, take here is not possible because we take. So he probably has to take first, take. If knight takes, we can pre-move that. This is forced. And then the mission after this, if this exchange happens here, is to, and it does happen, is to line up essentially all of the pieces that we can in order to target this weakness here. We also have the ability to remove one of the defenders here is something we can note. And maybe securing our e pawn here is also one of the priorities in this position. So this is a legit threat. Takes, and then we take here. But this position is definitely looking good for black here, I would say. All right, so we do have bishop here now. And notice how he could take this pawn here and then recapture here, but it allows his rook to get in here. So I think we should maybe refrain from that. Maybe we should play a slower move, like rook to d8, or secure our pawn here. I like to move rook to d8. And the threat is, I think, still we can capture. Okay, so I think now we can capture this and go after this pawn. Certainly. And I think with the knight, so we have two defenders. So takes, if queen takes, I think either way, how it's looking like to me is after knight takes, yeah, there is substantial threats here. So we hit. The only thing is, are we concerned about this pin here on our queen? And I think no. I think our knight is defended enough that we don't need to worry about that pin. So we have bishop takes. That's interesting. So I think queen takes. Let's see, which piece should we take with? Maybe bishop. Queen takes blunders this pawn. Rook takes. I think we should take probably with a bishop. And the reason is that he can't take this pawn because his rook hangs. And then it doesn't blunder our b pawn here. Also pressures this pawn on f2 here. So this might be the cleanest way to win material here. So could we stack our rooks here? Are we safe to do so in this position? I think actually probably yeah, because we don't have anything else essentially that can pressure our bishop immediately. We can't get attacked with pawns, right? So I think rook d7. And even if he does add another attacker, we can reinforce it with a rook, we can reinforce it with a pawn. So rook d7 here, then rook d8. And then we threaten maybe some tactics with this. And we also help to guard all of our back rank here, all of our second rank pawns. Okay, so this I think we can just play e6 to defend. Because obviously the one move threat here is taking on f7, so I don't see much wrong with simply reinforcing our pawn structure here. And next move, we intend to play rook d8. And this will still probably be a hard position to convert here. Okay. If here, I think we save this bishop through tactics. If rook here, I think we have... Yeah, I think we have bishop takes. Rook here, check, because if this takes, we take here, the rook hangs. If this takes, then we just simply take twice. So I think we're fine here. Okay, he sees it. Okay, and now we can play... Okay, does he have a threat here? I think maybe he does. But I think our threats are a little bit stronger here, so let's... Let's actually try to exchange queens first. And also, yeah, we're moving our queen to a slightly better square with more scope here. And I don't think he has any tactics that actually win him a significant amount of material here. So now we can access the back rank here using this attack here. Let's see. Yeah, we can use this attack. The rook moves, we play check. And that with devastating effect, mind you, since his king is now moved to a square that's it's able to be mated here with a rook and a bishop. So this is actually a pretty devastating move here, I would say. Bishop or rook takes, we could even just simply take that rook. All right, so I think this is still losing either way. I mean, I think either rook is good, but let's do a final calculation, hunker down for the final calculation here. So if we take, his intent is to go here with check. We move out a check. He takes here, here. But if we simply take here, his rook moves back. Then we can play takes, takes. We can play here. His rook is forced to take, and then we can move. So I think this is a little bit superior because it allows us to simplify here. to rook versus bishop. I think either way, it would essentially be rook versus bishop. And now, what is the priorities here? We need to get our king to the center of the board, and we need to not blunder our pawns here. So I think king here to start is good. And now we can play here. And in order to get our pawn to a dark square and cut off his king from ever coming to this side of the board, this side, because I intend to play rook here and park the rook on the D file here. Okay, so now we can play f5 in order to advance our king here without blundering this pawn, and it further restricts his king. And then we can look to advance these pawns before we advance our king. Okay. Let's advance these pawns because I don't want any bishop coming back around to win a pawn, essentially. And now I plan to advance the king and gain opposition here and slowly begin to target pawns here. So let's go here. And go here. Pressure both of these pawns. Okay, now we notice we could set up like a mate threat with rook here in order to take, but let's see. Let's drive his king back here. And then play like here he has check, which is kind of a problem. So we can play a waiting move. We can play a rook check. And then cut off his king this way. And then look to infiltrate with the king ourselves here. Okay, let's cut off his king one more time here, ensuring our pawns are on dark squares so the bishop can't attack them, and then look to infiltrate ourselves here. And then the objective will be to sacrifice the rook in order to make a passed pawn here. Now that his king is essentially put in jail here. This should be a winning endgame here now for us. Okay, yeah. It doesn't really matter where his bishop moves to here, there will be a pawn that will be able to go and promote here. So all right, so now we look to what is a way we can do this? We can go here, and next move, rook targets the pawn. And there is nothing he can do about this rook sacrifice incoming here. And it allows us to create too many pass pawns here for him to deal with. So let's calculate what takes, here, and we win. Because the red carpet is rolled out. Alright, so he refuses to take. So now we can play here. Cut off his king once again, and he will eventually be forced to take the pawn, or he can blunder his bishop here. Alright, so we win. That is resignation in the game there. And let's analyze the game. If we are allowed to do so here. Alright, so moving on to a review of the game here, we had d5, and we had the we had d4, knight f6, g6, knight f3, then bishop g7, moving into the king's Indian setup here, knight c3, d6, and then e4 normally is the next move here, but considering that this bishop can't be developed after e3, I think e3 is a little bit worse positionally than e4 long term in the king's Indian here. So we had castles proceeding with our normal plan. Bishop e2 is probably what I expected. And then there's a variety of candidate moves here. It says knight bd7, e5 even still works. Let's see why that is. Because after takes, queen takes, rook takes, knight takes e5, we have, so it wants to play knight a6, but knight e4, this still works, I guess, because even though we're a pawn down in this position, we have just more piece activity here. That's kind of obscure, and I didn't trust that, so I went c5 there. Kind of less obscure compensation here. And then c takes d4 is still probably good. e4 and then d5. Or d4, d5 here. h3, and now knight c6, we develop our knight, which is good. Rook e1 is good. Bishop to e6. It says, well, I guess it says it's good. It's the second best move here, other than just taking and creating an isolated queen spawn right off the bat. But takes, and now he's done the work for us. We can definitely take with a knight here is best. Bishop back to f1, and then queen b6, trying to put all of our eyes on this isolated queen's pawn. So taking, yeah, definitely makes it easy. We take back with a bishop. And rook f to d8 was the move I chose. Getting an extra on the queen, but also I think threatening is taking the knight and just proceeding from there. So now we take the knight, and knight takes, it says, is a bit of a mistake. I guess bishop takes right off the bat is a little bit better, but I thought since, you know, this hits the queen, it must still be okay, and it was still okay. So rook takes e7. I guess, yeah, I missed this. This was definitely a way to equalize here, so that was probably a blunder. But bishop takes, and then, yeah, rook d7, e6, solidifying our pawn structure, rook back to d8, trading our queens. So we kind of weaponize the queen trade here to try to move into a winning endgame. And this was definitely a blunder because of bishop c3. Bishop c3 after this move is devastating. So now this is kind of the only thing he had to go for. So either rook, I calculated, was winning. It moves into a winning endgame here, which he did play out. But ultimately, the technique of this endgame is to use your rook, essentially. At least how I played it was using my rook to cut off his king to behind his pawns here. So f4 completely cuts off his king, and it puts all my pawns on dark squares. And then I can move my king freely to take his pawn and create a passer here into a winning endgame. So takes is winning, and if bishop takes, king here, here is just totally winning. And we promote the pawn eventually. One of the pawns will eventually get promoted here. So that is my analysis of the game. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from the video. I'll see you on the next one.